later on. So just so you guys, are aware. All right, so hopefully everybody can see my screen. Okay. All right, so hopefully, guys, as you went on and worked on Khan Academy, you noticed that adding and subtracting integers are, to me, pretty easy. Okay, so the simple rules for adding integers are, so if we're going to add them, right, we would, if it's a positive added to a positive, then we just add them, and then my answer is positive. Okay, so if I had 5 plus 6, we just add them, we get 11. That's pretty kind of basic general knowledge. All right, so add two negatives. So if I had -5 plus -6, once again, we're just going to add them, and my answer would be -11. So then we would use the sign. So when it gets a little bit confusing is when we start subtracting. So hopefully you figured out if I'm going to subtract something. So let's say I've got -5 minus 6. Okay, so what hopefully Khan Academy showed you was that if you add the opposite, so if I add this, so I would have -5 plus, and then right now, technically this is +6. So I'm going to add and then make this become the opposite. So therefore, we still get -11. So if this was -6, then we would still add, and then we would take the opposite of that 6. And so what we have to do is we kind of have to look at, we take that absolute value, right? So if this is 6 and this is 5, we subtract them. So I would do the absolute value of 6 minus the absolute value of 5, which is 1. And then whatever the sign is of that larger one, that's what we use. So since 6 and it's positive, we're going to make that a +1. Okay, so hopefully that is what you got from that information. So lesson 4.4, which is the advanced topic, which don't get me wrong, integers is the advanced topic. So those of you that will move on to Algebra 1 next year, this will be one of the first lessons that we get to in Algebra 1, which is integers. And so hopefully this will put you guys a little step further. So lesson 4.4 is basically taking those same rules, applying them to properties, applying them to fractions and decimals. So if we look at this lesson, we're going to do a bunch of things. So the first one says that Andy usually skates for about 6 hours per week. On Monday, he spends 1/5 hour skating. On Wednesday, he spends 2 3/4 hours skating. And on Thursday, he spends 1 5/6. Andy wrote the following expression to find the number of hours he spent skating. He grouped Wednesday and Thursday together at first because those were his best days, without thinking too much about what would be easier to add. So I think we've talked about our properties, the associative property, the commutative property, the distributive property. And so those are the properties that we are going to use to combine these fractions. All right, so it says rewrite to make the fraction a little bit simpler to add. So if you notice, he put the parentheses here. So what we're going to do is we're going to move those parentheses, right? And so I still, and then this one's still going to be 1 5/6. Asking me what property is demonstrated. So all we did is rearrange those parentheses. So if you remember, that is the associative property. And that one, since we're adding, it would be of addition, right? All right, so it says regrouping makes the problem simpler because it associates two numbers with, and as you can see, we grouped them together because it gives us the common denominators. Oh, and y'all can't see that, sorry. Common denominators. All right, so then we're going to add. So what they teach us here is that we can add the whole numbers together. So 1, 2, and 1. Oh, hold on. We're doing parentheses first, my bad. So 1 and 2 gives me that 3. And then since those common denominators are the same, we would get 1/5 and 3/5, which would be 4/5. They're both positive, so we just basically follow those adding and subtracting rules. So if they're both positive, add them together and you'll get positive. So if I combine the whole number, a fraction, I get 3 and 4/5. So then see, they brought down the 3 and 4/5. We're going to bring down the 1 and 5/6. And now we have to find those common denominators. So what they did first was they converted them to a fraction greater than 1. So if you remember, 3 times 5 is 15, plus 4 gives me 19. They've already told me this one's 11/6. So my common denominator would be 30. So remember, we have to make those equivalent fractions. So that means if I do 5 into 30, which is 6, I have to also multiply that by 6 to get 114. Okay, so same thing here. If this is 30, I have to multiply that 11 by 5 to get 55. And then we just add them together. So that gives me 169 divided by 30, which if we divide that, it gives me 5 and 19/30. And we can't simplify that. Okay. So if you look at that turn and talk, it says, is there another way to solve this problem? Well, of course, we can always convert the fraction to a decimal. Okay. So if we convert that, we know that 1 and 1/5 would be 1 and 2/10. We know that 2 and 3/5 would be 2 and 6/10, and 1 and 5/6 is 1 and 83/100. Okay, so I will say that sometimes you have to be careful when you convert your fractions to decimals. For example, 1/3. 1/3 is that repeating decimal, so it continues on and on. So sometimes converting them to decimals isn't always the easier way. Okay. All right. So let's move on. So if you're looking at this one, it says Rochelle dives into a lake from water surface. Her change in elevation in the lake is described. So descend, ascend, descends, descends, and ascends. So descend means that we are going under that surface. Okay, and then ascend means that we're coming up. All right, so we're going to write an expression to represent Rochelle's change in elevation. All right, so descend would be a negative 15.5. Ascend would be a positive 8 and 1/5. Of course, descend would be negative 1 and 6/10. Descend would be negative 20 and 4/10, and this one would be a positive 15 and 5/10. So we're going to write that down here. All right, so we have negative 15 and 5/10 plus 8 and 1/5 plus negative 1 and 6/10 plus negative and 20 and 4/10 plus 15 and 5/10. Okay, so also, instead of making these negatives, So I said negative 15 and 5/10 plus 8 and 1/5 minus 1 and 6/10 minus 20 and 4/10, and then came back and added the 5 and 5/10. Okay, so what I usually tell my students when I get them in algebra is negatives and subtractions mean the same thing in algebra. Okay, so because we are always adding that opposite, it technically they're the same. Okay, so that's how those two ways you could have written that. All right, so then it wants us to use our properties to rewrite things to make them easier to add. All right, so what I would do was I would add the negative 15 and 5/10 and the positive 15 and 5/10. So that would be the first thing I would group together. Okay, and then I can put this 8 and 1/5 kind of anywhere I wanted it, right? Because right now it's the only fraction. And then I would add to that those two negatives. And once again, I could have said this was negative 1/6 minus 20 and 4/10. Either way, I could have written them that way, okay, because they mean the same thing. All right, so hopefully you can see that this one cancels, right? And then, so that's going to give me D, right? Add the opposite, so that would give me 0 plus 8 and 1/5. And then hopefully you can see that the reason why we can combine these, because if I add 6 and 4, it gives me 10. So that's going to come back down here. So let me, because this one only told me to add the opposite, right? So we're just going to rewrite there. All right, so let's go back up here. So because I rearranged, I know I used parentheses, but the original problem didn't have any parentheses. So that property that we did basically just rearrange is that commutative property. And that would be, since we're still dealing with addition, it's addition. Okay. All right, so now back to re-adding. All right, so as you can see, they rearranged again, right? So 8 and 1/5, they moved here. We know that 0, 0, so we're just going to kind of delete that. So negative 6 and 1/10, negative 20 and 4/10. When we add those together, negative and a negative, so they're the same signs, we're going to add them. So that gives me negative 22. All right, and then that property, because we rearranged again, would be that commutative. Okay. All right, so then, as you can see, they converted the 8 and 1/5 to a decimal. So minus 22. So the rule says we take those absolute values, right? So we're going to subtract them. So 22 negative minus 8 and 2/10. So 22 minus 8 and 2/10 is 13 and 8/10. We use the sign of the larger absolute value, which is negative. So my answer would be negative. Okay, so negative 13 and 8/10 would be that answer. All right, now you have to kind of look at the questions that they're asking you. So it says Rochelle is blank feet below the water surface. So since they already used that word below, I don't need to put my negative. Okay, so Rochelle is 13 and 8/10 feet below the surface. Okay. So then that turn and talk says, how are the properties of addition used to evaluate the expression in part 2 and task 2? So we added the opposites and then added the two negatives. Okay. All right, so let's look at the last one. And I know I'm over time. Kids log in, but that's okay. All right, so it says Terry is hiking in a valley at its lowest elevation. Abe is hiking at a different trail at an elevation of 23 and 5/10 meters above sea level. How much higher in elevation is Abe than Terry? So we're talking distance on a number line. So how should the elevation below sea level be written? So we've talked about that. So sea level would be 0, below would be negative. Okay. So since one number is a decimal and one contains a fraction, you must either convert the decimal to a fraction or the fraction to a decimal before evaluating. So now we're going to complete the expression to show the differences between their elevations. So 23 and 5/10 minus a negative 19 and 3/4, because it says it up here, it's below sea level, right? So it would have to be a negative. All right, so we're going to add the opposite. So this becomes addition, and this becomes the opposite. So if it's negative, this becomes positive. Okay. So now I'm going to write 19 and 3/4 as a decimal. So it becomes 19 and 75/100. They're both addition. So we're going to just add them together. So we get 43 and 25/100. Okay, so that's the distance. One is above, one is below. So the distance between them are 43 and 25/100. And we're talking meters, right? So then Abe is 43 and 25 meters higher in elevation than Terry. Okay, so it says, is your answer reasonable? And so that would be yes. And the reason why is same thing we just said. One is above and the other is below sea level. Okay. All right. So are there any questions from you guys? That's the end of that lesson. So questions about adding and subtracting integers. Now's the time to ask. All right. So doesn't sound like it. All right, so you're on your own exit ticket. It has been assigned in into math. It's only a couple questions. I did attach the paper version as well, so you can do it on paper and upload it into Focus, whatever is easier for you guys. You automatically get 10 points for just joining the live session. All right, and then you will also get 10 more additional points for completing that on your own. Okay. All right, so if you guys have nothing else, we are done. All right, so you can log off. And I'm going to stop recording. You have a question? Someone have a question? No? All right, you guys have a good one.